Hello friends, it's me Marie here. Today I'm going to show you how to can or to jar tomatoes. These are just regular diced tomatoes that I'm going to process using water bath canning or water boiling process. I have here some of the tomatoes that I have from my garden, and they are freshly picked, and since I have extra, I'm going to process them. And you can actually process store-bought tomatoes. It would be nice if they're organic and freshly picked. I will be using quart jars. I have two different types of jars, the wide mouth jars and the regular mouth jars. The regular mouth, it's smaller than wide mouth jars, but since I don't have a lot of the lids for regular mouth, so I'll be using some of the wide mouth jars. Before canning, make sure that the rims or the lips are clear from nicks and cracks. Use your fingers and feel if there is anything that's catching on the lips and the rims, because if they do, it will be difficult for the jars to process or to seal. So make sure that you individually feel the rims. Make sure that there are nothing that could prevent them from sealing completely. Wash the jars thoroughly using hot water. You can put these jars in dishwasher using the hot cycle, or you can wash them just using your hot water in your faucet using brush and soap, and rinse them thoroughly and make sure that there's no soap smell. Or you can use also water boiling to sterilize or to clean the jars. After washing them with just regular tepid water, you can submerge the jars individually and make sure that you're using gloves or tongs to lift the jars so your fingers or your hands won't get burned. In a pot, put some water and bring it to a boil and put all the lids. This is a sterilizing process. Now let's cut our tomatoes. You can cut dice or cubes or wedges and just put them directly in the jars. Using this funnel, it'll be easier if you can just put them in there. It's very helpful. And just put them inside as you cut. Be careful when you slice the tomatoes. I usually use a bigger knife. And as you put the tomatoes inside, pack it. I use a ladle to help pack the tomatoes so there's no empty spaces. And as you fill it in, make sure that there is at least 1.5 inch space from the neck of the jar to the rim, so about 1.5 inches, so it has more boiling room for when it's doing the boiling process. You can also jar smaller tomatoes like the Roma tomatoes. They are really good when you can them because they're firmer, and usually tomatoes have these round black spots. You can remove them, but a lot of cherry tomatoes, just like the ones I have here, you can remove the black spots if you want to, or you can just cut it half or quarter, or you can just put them directly in the jars just like that. It saves time, huh? After putting all the diced tomatoes in the jars, put canning salt. It is recommended that you put canning or pickling salt, because canning or pickling salt, there's no additives or there's no anti-caking agent. So this is recommended, the canning and pickling salt. For every quart jar, I put 1 teaspoon of canning salt, like that. Salt is to help with the preservation and to give flavor to your tomatoes. If you use the pint jars, which are smaller, pint jars, you only use a half a teaspoon pickling salt or canning salt. After putting the salt, wipe the rims Just make sure that there are no pieces or grain of salt, no seeds, and pieces of skin, because it can prevent the jars from sealing properly or completely. So make sure they are all wiped up and clean. Now it's time to put the lids, the canning lids. You can use a pair of tongs, or you can use a canning stick. A canning stick has a magnet at the end that would help lift the canning lids easily. And now you screw on these rings. You don't have to sterilize the rings, but make sure that they are washed clean with hot water. There you go. Screw on the rings tight, but not too tight and not loose, because you want your jars to seal properly. Individually put the canned tomatoes in the rack. My canning kit, my water bath canning kit, can fit 7 jars. So this is what I have, and I'm going to take this outside. I'm going to do the process outside on our deck, because if I do the process inside the house, it just creates a lot of steam and it gets hot in here. So let's begin the process. So I have the canning pot here. This is for water bath canning. I'm going to submerge the entire thing, including the rack, inside the canning pot. And make sure that you add more water, and that the water will cover the jars at least about 1.5 inches or 1 inch, like that. It's for boiling process, and we're going to cover the pot and turn the heat on high. We're going to wait for the water to boil, and then we're going to set our timer for 40 to 45 minutes. While waiting for the water to boil, I'm going to tell you something. There are 2 different processes when you do vegetable or fruit canning. While I'm doing water bath canning right now, because tomatoes are acidic, and your tomatoes and other fruits that are acidic, you can do water bath canning or water boiling process. While your vegetables and low acid fruits, and mostly the vegetables, you must do it using pressure canning process. I'm using quart jars, and the normal process for canning or boiling process for tomatoes should take about 40 minutes to process, but since I'm living on a hill, an elevated area, I'm going to add 5 more minutes to that. So I will be processing these tomatoes or this batch for 45 minutes. It takes longer period to do water bath canning or water boiling process than pressure canning. You can also do pressure canning on high acid, just like tomatoes. You can do pressure canning on other fruits, but it takes only shorter period of time, for about 15 minutes to 20 minutes, because it's a faster process, and that's just the difference. Canning is not hard, it's not complicated, but you just have to be willing to do it and make sure that you follow the manual and read the instructions carefully, because you don't want your food, the vegetables and fruits, to spoil, because the principle or the reason why you're doing canning is to preserve the vegetables or the fruits. Okay? The water is boiling. It's really boiling right now, so I'm going to set the timer for 45 minutes. Since my house is located on a hill, I'm going to set the timer for 45 minutes. On a normal elevation, like if you're living in a city and your house is not located on a hill, you can safely do the boiling process for 40 minutes. But since I'm using quart jars, and my house is about 1,000 feet altitude, So I'm going to do 45 minutes process. Now that it's boiling, I'm going to lower the heat. There you go. Now we're just gonna wait. Time is up. Now let's turn off the stove. You can still hear the jars boiling inside. We'll wait for a few more minutes before we open it so that we don't shock the jars, the sudden temperature. So we'll let it sit there for a few minutes. The water boiling process is done, and I'm going to open the pot slowly and away from my face because I don't want my face to get burned. The steam is very hot. As you can see, the jars are still boiling inside, and I'm going to lift the rack slowly and just let it sit there for a moment. There you go. And we will just let the jars cool off. We can cover these jars so we don't shock them. The sudden temperature, and then we'll let it sit there for a few more minutes, and we will start to hear the popping sound. The popping sound is when the jars seal itself. You see the bulge spots on the lids. The pressure inside, as the jars cool off, it will suck in the pressure. The suction process will seal the jars, and we'll just wait for the jars to cool off naturally. And later on, we will see the bulge spots become dented. Okay, our jars have cooled off. They sat on the deck for 12 hours. It's now time to check for the lids and the seal. It seems like they all sealed up well and completely. I don't see any bulge spots, because if they did not seal completely, you will see bulge spots in the middle. Let's remove these jars. After 12 hours, you can safely remove the rings of the jars and save the rings, because you can reuse these rings for later canning process. Make sure that you wash them good and let them dry, because if you don't, they will get rusty. After removing the rings, wipe the lids because it gets sticky, and after wiping it with damp cloth, you write the lids, the name of the vegetable that you can, and the date or the year for when you can this batch of vegetable. The jars are labeled and they are ready for storing, but before you store these jars, check the seal one more time if they are still intact, because sometimes after you remove the rings, the pressure inside the jar gets released, especially if the jar did not process correctly. So you can do two things. You can eat the contents of that jar as soon as you can, or you can refrigerate that jar with the contents inside. The contents will stay in the refrigerator for several weeks before it goes bad. These jarred tomatoes or canned tomatoes are ready for storing. You can put them in a box or you can put them in your pantry. Make sure that they are safe, because these jars are breakable. And once these jars are empty, you can reuse them, because these jars are reusable if you want to can again. The contents inside the tomatoes, you can eat them next month, next year, or several years from now, even up to 5 years, as long as the seals are still intact. And if you have a recipe that requires tomatoes, you can use these tomatoes. It's great for tomato soup, vegetable soup, and you can even make an instant pasta sauce or pizza sauce. You blend them up and add seasonings or herbs, and they're great. And if you want to try canning or jarring vegetables or tomatoes, make sure that you follow the instructions or the manual so that you do it correctly and safely. And that's it. I hope you enjoy this recipe or this process, canning process. Feel free to share it with your families and friends. Thank you. Thank you for watching. I will see you in my next video.